Hey, I'm Javi Golden with the Design Thinking Academy. In honor of Election Day, we'll be talking with Professor Roger Moiles about two proposals that changed Michigan elections forever.
My name is Roger Moiles, Moiles, and I am Senior Affiliate Professor of Political Science.
Awesome. Thank you. We're talking about the 2018 Michigan election reforms, specifically Proposal 2 and Proposal 3. And those were instituted in 2018. But what was the status quo thinking about equitable voting, who can vote and who can't vote? What was the status quo before the 2018 reforms were instituted?
Well, we almost have to take those a little bit separately. If you think about Proposal 2, it was dealing with the redistricting process. And the problem we had in Michigan, as in many other states, was a problem of what we call gerrymandering, where it was left up to the legislature to decide where to draw the district lines for the U.S. House and for the Michigan House and the Michigan Senate. And the problem is we have partisan legislatures, of course, and they're going to draw lines that benefit their own members. And since they can do that for an entire decade after a census count, we've seen several decades now of that. And so the last couple of decades, it had been Republicans in control and setting the lines in their favor. Before that, it was Democrats, and they were setting lines in their favor. And so, when the politicians are drawing their own borders, then they're picking the voters they want in that district. And so that really disenfranchises a lot of people. Anyone who might want to have a competitive district and they're not able to because there's some manipulation there. So it would work broadly. It was something that, at different times, Republicans or Democrats would be at a disadvantage. On the other proposal, Proposal 3, which dealt with, more election reforms, the problem was that Michigan had fallen so far behind other states in terms of how to deal with registration issues. I mean, we live in an age of technology where you can get a car loan approved in minutes. You could get a mortgage approved perhaps in a matter of an hour or a few hours in an afternoon sometimes. And yet the state of Michigan was requiring people to register 30 days before the election. And so, it was a matter of ease and some of that. It was also where people had difficulties because they couldn't at least honestly request an absentee ballot. Michigan had a limited scope for who could officially request an absentee ballot. And many other states had opened it wide open and said, if you want an absentee ballot, just ask for one. But Michigan had held off on doing that. And so it meant that a lot more people really did have to go to the polls or else lie to their state about why they're getting an absentee ballot. It was this list of about a half a dozen things, and you had to fit into one of those. And so, frankly, I'll tell you, over the years, because I'm a political scientist and I'm usually working a lot on election day, I would always just claim I'm going to be out of town. I live in Holland. I was going to be in Allendale or in Grand Rapids for much of the day. But the idea that, there could be millions of people who really would like to be able to get an absentee ballot from, the comfort of their own home, to be able to research it and fill it out as they go. They were the ones who really were being put off and forced to go to the polls. And, one of the things about our elections is, we don't take the election day as a holiday. And so people do have to work, and the polls are open from 7 in the morning until 8 p.m. But that doesn't work with people's schedules in a lot of cases. There are people that are working, before that and after that, and it's difficult. Or families, suppose it's a single parent and they want to go vote, but they've got a bunch of kids and it's November and they're afraid they're going to have to stand in line. So they're people who would benefit from having an absentee ballot that they could just simply request. You could make it automatic, that they could have an automatic request for for a ballot. So, there are a lot of different folks that had been kind of left out of this, and it was made more impractical for folks. And there had been many proposals over the years to do something about that, and the legislature never took it up.
What did the reforms look like once they were put into place, and what will they look like for Proposal 2? Because we won't be seeing the effects of that for a little bit now.
Yeah. For Proposal 3, and I should say these proposals all passed overwhelmingly. It was about 60% for each. There was Proposal 1 was also on the ballot, and that was for recreational marijuana. And all three of those proposals passed very easily. With Proposal 3, the election reforms one, that was something that almost immediately went into effect. This year is the first major election cycle that we've had where it would be tested more fully. But, in 2019, you would have some smaller elections, like for a school millage or sometimes just electing trustees to the school board, or maybe the city of Grand Rapids electing a mayor. And so that they usually don't, it's not a statewide sort of thing. It's just sort of here and there. And so it began to take effect almost immediately. We probably didn't see a whole lot of changes at that point because, most people who participate in those kind of lesser elections, they're ones who do it regularly and they were already registered to vote. The ability for some of them perhaps to get an absentee ballot for that school board election may have been more convenient for someone. But, one of the problems we have too is that turnout in elections, our turnout is not always very good. In a big election like this presidential year, we're thinking about possibly record turnout, either through absentee ballots or in person. And, we could, it makes it more difficult for people if they're going to show up at the polls and have that threat of waiting in line. So consequently, even some of these smaller elections where it is the township trustees or the school board, we might see turnout being under 10%. Well, if you offer people then an absentee ballot that they can just do it at home and drop it off or mail it in, we might see more people participating in those smaller elections too. So we started to see it in 2019. And then in 2020 now, as we began the year early on, we had the presidential primary back in March. And that was mostly then on the Democratic side because President Trump really didn't have any opposition. And so we started to see it there where you could have an absentee ballot for that election. And then in August, the regular primary election for all of the other offices in Michigan. And so we saw it fully implemented in those cases. But, what's interesting this year is obviously we're in the midst of this pandemic and things had to change in order to deal with this. It's a big deal to have a presidential election. Every race, it seems like, every seat in the U.S. House, a third of the U.S. Senate comes up. We have a number of other positions down the line as you get down to, the counties and townships and other communities. You have so much there that we have to vote on. And the idea that millions of people would have to either decide to go to the polls and risk their health and their safety or, something else. Well, this gave us that option that we could actually get millions of people voting that way. So the ones who do want to go to the polls tomorrow on Tuesday, November 3rd, the ones who want to go to the polls then, they're not going to face quite as much risk if they make that choice because you've got millions of voters who opted to simply stay home and mail it in or drop it off. It protects everyone that way. And so I think we're seeing really the benefits of Proposal 2, especially there. And it took the Secretary of State using some license really to look at this Proposal 2 or Proposal 3 and say, here's the authorization that anyone can have an absentee ballot if they request it. And what Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State, did in Michigan was send out a form that says you can apply for an absentee ballot. Send it out to every registered voter who was not already an absentee balloter, not already on the list, and said, here, you can have this and then people would decide if they wanted to or not, and they could request it. But as of a week before the election, we've had 3.1 million was the last figure requested of people that received absentee ballots. And as of a week before the election, again, the number that had come in was about 2.1 million. And probably by election day, which is the deadline to turn them in, I'm betting it'll be at 2.5 million or more that'll come back in. So those are all people that that didn't have to go to the polls. Now, some of them, they're always have been absentee balloters, but a smaller number. So we may have picked up 1 million more people on absentee ballots this time who are not going to be out there at risk for themselves or perhaps putting other people at risk.
Wow.
Now, you asked also about Proposal 2. If you'd like me to go on that?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
Please.
So Proposal 2 is the one about redistricting, and what that creates is an independent commission. And instead of having legislators get together and plot out the maps and figure out how to maximize the voters that they want, instead it will be private citizens. And that process requires that there are a select number of people who identify as Democrats and a number of people who identify as Republicans, and then a number of people who identify as independents, that they don't have any attachment to party. And they applied, they were randomly selected, they were vetted to make sure that they didn't have conflicts or that they hadn't expressed a real partisan interest. Because the idea of that commission is to have private citizens that across the board who will not be looking for that kind of partisan advantage, and that they'll be checking each other on this. So their work, they have been selected by now, but their work really begins next year after the census data has been sent out to the states. For one thing, Michigan will have to find out how many House seats, U.S. House seats we'll have, because Michigan presently has 14, and it's expected we're going to lose one of those, go to 13 next year. And so they will, when they're redrawing these lines, they're going to eliminate one congressional district. And, in the past, what the state legislatures would do is if your party was in the majority in the state legislature, you'd make sure that the district that you cut out is from the opposition party, right? You cut out a district from them. And Michigan, in fact, has lost many seats over the last several census counts. So in this case, it will be private citizens and hopefully a balanced panel that will be trying to lay this out in districts that make the most sense. But their work really won't get going until we get into 2021. And then we'll see. And we'll see the first effects of that then 2 years from now in the 2022 congressional elections.
What's next? What are the remaining challenges? Obviously, this idea of letting people vote from home, and the idea that people will be voting for candidates who actually represent them. Those are two massive challenges that we faced. But what's next in terms of making voting more equitable?
I think we still have some work to do in some communities. Our election system is really decentralized. In Michigan, the responsibility for these elections is mostly left up to the county level and then to the city or the township or village level. And in some ways that's a benefit because there's less chance of hacking into a system and somebody tinkering with things, because all of these different, they all use somewhat different systems and report their totals at the end of the day. But it also means that there are some communities that don't have the resources for the best equipment. We sometimes might have to look at the number of precincts, the neighborhood sites that people go to vote, because especially in urban centers, there's been a problem in the past where you might have a big turnout of especially of people of color turning out to vote at a certain place, and they don't have enough voting machines, or they should have put in another precinct because you've got enough population there for it, but the elections officials didn't think they'd need as many. And so you end up with people that have to wait in long lines. We had a case at GVSU 4 years ago when they really started pushing for student registration to vote. and they set up a precinct over on Lake Michigan Drive. And it was in one of these little storefront locations. And they ran out of ballots on election day. And in 2016, it was a rainy election day in Allendale. And you had students that were standing in line for 2 hours waiting to vote because they didn't have enough ballots. And you can't just run off to the next, the next town and get ballots, because they have to be specific to the local races. And so they had to go have more printed and brought in, and the students, to their credit, waited. Most of them waited there for a couple of hours in cold and rainy weather. But that's the sort of thing, I think, that, if you know that could happen, that you could be stuck in a situation like that, or if you have kids and you're worried about long lines, in some cases, that may be something. Some people will still want to go to the polls and vote. It's an important part of things, that feeling of walking out. You get the little sticker that says, I voted. And a lot of people like that. And not everyone wants to switch over to simply absentee balloting. But I think we still have to keep making it easier and more accessible. And I think a sense of outreach to people that haven't participated a lot, to make sure that they understand that this is important and it's important to their future, that they ought to have a voice in it, and that this is a way to do it.